Ever feel like to really get economics, you need like a PhD and a crystal ball?
Yeah.
Well, today we're taking a deep dive into a book that's considered, like the foundation of it all.
Oh, okay.
Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But don't worry, we're not tackling the whole thing. Our experts here to help us pull out those real aha moments.
All right. Sounds good.
Ready to see what insights from like the 1700s are still surprisingly relevant today?
Let's do it.
Let's go.
I've always found it fascinating how observations from centuries past still kind of resonate in today's, economic landscape.
Before we like decode all the theories and stuff, tell me, who was Adam Smith? The source material mentions he spent time in Kirkcaldy and Glasgow. How did those places like influence his thinking?
Yeah, so it's easy to picture economists, right, as these like detached scholars. But Smith was actually really immersed in the real world, like growing up in Kirkcaldy. That exposed him to the mechanics of local trade, something a lot of people kind of take for granted these days.
Right.
And then Glasgow. During the Industrial Revolution, no less. I mean, imagine witnessing firsthand that surge of like productivity and innovation and, yeah, all the social changes that come with that.
It wasn't all like factories and shipyards, though, right? There's this detail about Smith spending a decade with his mother after his travels, almost resisting that, like, pull of the city. Sounds like my kind of guy.
Well, he certainly took his time crafting the Wealth of Nations, didn't he? Almost like he knew it'd become, a cornerstone of economic thought.
And speaking of which, let's get to the good stuff.
Yeah.
I was really struck by his concept of, like, real versus nominal value.
Okay, yeah.
He uses this example of what half an ounce of silver could buy in different eras.
Yeah.
And wow, talk about inflation.
Right. It's a point that's easily missed, when we reminisce about like the good old days of low prices. But Smith nails in the price tag. That nominal value doesn't tell the whole story. What matters is how much that silver actually buys you its real value.
So like my grandma reminiscing about a nickel buying a candy bar. But forgetting that nickel was a bigger deal back then relative to, wages and all that.
Exactly. To really illustrate it, Smith points out that while half an ounce of silver, might have been the going rate for a bushel of wheat in his time, centuries earlier, during the reign of Henry III, that same amount could snag you 8 bushels.
8 times the buying power.
Yeah.
That's wild. How does Smith suggest we account for these fluctuations when we're comparing prices across different periods?
He emphasizes focusing on labor as that measure of value. Essentially, the power of purchasing is key. To compare accurately, we need to consider how much labor those different quantities of silver could buy. Think of it as like the original cost of living index.
Makes sense.
Right.
Of course, finding reliable wage data from like centuries ago is probably impossible.
It's definitely a challenge, which is why Smith often uses grain prices as like a proxy. They were more consistently recorded, and provide a decent snapshot of how purchasing power fluctuated over time.
So like if the price of a basic good, like wheat, is all over the place, imagine the chaos for merchants trying to price their goods. Which actually reminds me, Smith talks about how merchants would try to keep rising prices a secret, almost like they understood real value, like instinctively.
Absolutely. They weren't keen on advertising their profit margins. Smith explains that when the market price, what things are actually selling for, climbs above the natural price, which is closer to the cost of production, merchants clam up. If everyone knew they were making a killing, competition would flood in and drive those prices right back down.
Classic supply and demand. Even way back then. This whole information is power thing, it isn't exactly a new phenomenon, huh?
Not at all. Even in the 1700s, those in the know, they had a real advantage. Makes you wonder how Smith would react to, like, the instant information flow of today's markets.
Speaking of things that make you wonder, let's talk about this case of wages and plenty. It seems kind of counterintuitive, Smith's arguing that sometimes wages go up when food is, abundant and cheap.
It does, doesn't it? You'd think cheap necessities would equal lower wages, right? But Smith's focusing on the demand for labor. He uses the example of, like, farmers needing more hands to bring in a bumper crop.
True.
Even if food prices are low, that surge in demand for farm labor, well, that can drive wages higher.
Because suddenly there aren't enough workers to go around. It's like today's gig economy. Like if the demand for ride shares skyrockets, drivers can command those higher rates, even if, say, gas prices are low.
A perfect modern parallel. Smith might not have used the term elasticity of labor markets, but that's exactly what he was describing.
Wow.
When the demand for a certain type of work, outstrips the supply, prices go up, even if the cost of goods is down. It's a classic case of economics defying common sense.
Okay, so we've got sneaky merchants, counterintuitive wages.
Yeah.
What else did Smith have up his sleeve? There's this part where he talks about towns being like a continual fair or market for the surrounding countryside. What's the takeaway there?
This is where we really see his ideas about specialization and trade take center stage. Smith argued that towns, early cities, they weren't just consumers of rural resources. They were these engines of growth that benefited everyone involved.
So not just this one-way street of farmers sending goods into the city.
Right. It was a two-way exchange. Farmers brought their produce to sell, but in return, they got access to all these manufactured goods, services that they couldn't find elsewhere. And this concentration of, producers and consumers in one place,
Yeah,
that's what really facilitated specialization.
because artisans and craftsmen could focus on honing their skills and increasing their output,
Right.
knowing there was a readily available market for all their products.
Exactly. This, in turn, created even more opportunities for trade and, fueled economic activity, a win-win situation.
So much for that image of parasitic towns just sucking resources from the poor countryside.
It was a mutually beneficial relationship, and it actually foreshadows Smith's broader point. You see, specialization and trade, they're key to increasing wealth, not just for individuals, but for entire nations. He was advocating for what we now call comparative advantage, and this is centuries before it became common knowledge.
Mind-blowing how ahead of his time he was.
Truly. And on that note, let's shift gears to another example of Smith challenging the conventional wisdom of his era, his views on apprenticeships.
This is where he talks about how those systems, though meant to protect skilled trades, could actually backfire, especially during economic downturns.
Right.
It's those were from the government and we're here to help, moments that always make you nervous.
Exactly. Smith was a real champion of free markets, and he saw these regulations, while well-intentioned, as ultimately stifling competition and hurting the very people they were meant to protect.
Like when he uses weavers as an example.
Right.
He talks about how apprenticeship laws made it really tough for linen weavers, silk weavers, and woolen weavers to switch between those trades, even though their skills were largely transferable.
It seems absurd now, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Smith argued that if one weaving sector struggled, those workers should be able to easily transition to a, more prosperous one. This would prevent wages from plummeting in that declining sector and, keep things from getting out of hand in the thriving one.
But those apprenticeship laws acted like roadblocks, right? Hindering workers' ability to adapt to these changing economic realities.
Precisely. It's a reminder that even well-intentioned regulations can have those unintended consequences, something worth considering when we look at our own economic policies today. Speaking of which,
This is where his analysis of gold and silver comes in, right? And how even back then, people were obsessed with their value.
yes, and Smith's perspective on precious metals just might surprise you. He actually challenged that prevailing view that a nation's wealth was directly tied to its reserves of gold and silver. That perspective known as mercantilism.
Yeah.
Right.
Like equating a country's wealth with how much, bling it's got locked up in a vault somewhere.
Exactly. Smith argued that true wealth lies in a nation's productive capacity. It's about its ability to produce goods and services that people actually need and want. Hoarding precious metals doesn't really do that.
Makes sense. And he uses this example about, Birmingham's consumption of gold and silver to make his point, right? I recall it was just this tiny fraction of the total amount that was actually traded.
That's right. Smith really highlighted that even if the supply of gold and silver, increased, their value wouldn't necessarily just plummet as long as demand kept pace or even, surpassed it. After all, gold and silver, they weren't just for stuffing treasure chests.
Right.
They were essential for trade, crafting these exquisite goods and just everyday transactions.
So it's not simply about how much gold a nation possesses, it's how it's used.
Yeah.
And how much, people are willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
Basic supply and demand. Even for precious metals.
Precisely. And what's so fascinating? This concept, still relevant today. Think about those ongoing debates surrounding gold's value as, the safe haven asset, or the impact of quantitative easing on currency values.
It's amazing how Smith was grappling with these intricate economic theories way back in the 18th century. Though I can't help but wonder, does his view on gold and silver still hold water in today's world, right? With digital currencies and fiat money and all that.
That's a question that sparks plenty of debate, even among economists today. While the context has certainly evolved, I think, those, fundamental principles that Smith identified, they remain relevant. The value of any asset, whether it's gold bars, company stock, or even like a cryptocurrency,
Yeah.
it ultimately hinges on supply and demand. And those forces are influenced by, a whole host of factors, right? You've got global economic conditions, technological advancements, even just general investor sentiment.
It seems like the world of economics is always in this state of flux, right? Constantly evolving.
It certainly is. And that's why we need, brilliant minds like Adam Smith to help us make sense of it all.
Couldn't agree more. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive into the wealth of nations. Smith's background, his ideas about real versus nominal value, market prices, those
Yeah.
quirky wage fluctuations, the role of towns, the impact of regulations, and even just like the age-old fascination with gold and silver. It's incredible how one book can hold so much insight.
It truly is. And honestly, we've only just scratched the surface. Smith's work is so rich and nuanced. It could fuel countless deep dives.
Well, I'm always game to keep exploring. But for now, let's give our listener, something specific to ponder, something tied to what we've been discussing.
That sounds like a great way to, wrap things up. What do you have in mind?
Well, we've talked about how Smith perceived the economic world of his time, but I'm curious, what hidden connections might we be missing in our own economy today? What might seem like a simple economic indicator, right? Like, say, the price of a certain commodity, but could actually hold the key to understanding those larger forces that are shaping our lives. It kind of reminds me of that table of wheat prices in England that you provided going all the way back to the 1590s.
Ah, yes. Smith used that data to, demonstrate how economic conditions, wars, even just the weather could cause these dramatic price fluctuations over time.
And I imagine those fluctuations had real world consequences for everyday people, not just, numbers on a spreadsheet.
Absolutely. For example, Smith points out that between 1595 and 1620, the average price for a quarter of wheat was, roughly 2 pounds, 1 shilling and 7 pence. But there were years where it shot up to almost 3 pounds, and others when it plummeted to less than 1 pound, 10 shillings. Imagine the impact on families who depended on bread as, this staple food.
Talk about economic uncertainty.
Yeah.
That's a swing of almost 2 pounds for a basic necessity. It really highlights how economic trends, even those that seem, far removed from our daily lives, can have this ripple effect.
Precisely. And it underscores the importance of understanding those, larger forces at play.
It's like Smith is sending a message through the centuries. Don't get too comfortable with how things are because the economic landscape, it can shift dramatically.
A timeless message indeed.
So while we can't predict the future, maybe by, understanding those historical patterns and underlying economic forces, we can be a bit more prepared for whatever, comes our way.
Exactly. It's about cultivating that awareness and, being adaptable in the face of change.
On that note, I think it's time we shift our focus from historical wheat prices to something a little more contemporary.
Yeah.
Adam Smith's thoughts on, circulating capital. It always fascinates me how he connected these seemingly abstract concepts to the tangible realities of, business and trade.
His analogy of the water pond with streams flowing in and out, it's brilliant. It perfectly illustrates how circulating capital, those things that are constantly in motion, like money, raw materials, those finished goods, they need to be replenished and kept flowing for that whole system to function.
It's such a vivid image, right?
Yeah.
Helps you grasp the concept immediately. And it ties back to his emphasis on productivity and ensuring that resources are used effectively to actually create value. I'm starting to see a recurring theme here.
And what theme would that be?
It seems like almost every economic principle we've discussed, it links back to Smith's, famous concept of the invisible hand. That idea that individuals, simply by pursuing their own self-interest, can unintentionally contribute to the greater good of society.
That's a keen observation. Smith truly believed that when individuals are free to chase those, their own economic goals, guided by those forces of supply and demand, they create this self-regulating system that can benefit, everyone.
So it's not about everyone being altruistic.
Yeah.
Even actions driven by self-interest can have a positive ripple effect.
That was Smith's central argument. However, it's important to remember he wasn't advocating for a, free-for-all where anything goes. He recognized the need for, rules and boundaries,
Right.
To ensure fairness and stability.
So even the invisible hand needs a little guidance sometimes.
Precisely. Smith believed that while markets are these powerful engines of, prosperity, there are limits to their self-regulation. He saw a role for government intervention in cases of like market failures, protection of, say, property rights, and ensuring that level playing field.
So it's not about, government bad, markets good, or vice versa. It's about striking that balance,
Yeah.
recognizing that both have a role to play in a healthy economy, which, come to think of it, is a debate that continues to rage on even today, centuries after Smith first, put pen to paper.
It certainly is. And it speaks to the, enduring relevance of his ideas.
Speaking of enduring relevance, there's one final concept from Smith that I'd love to delve into before we, wrap things up. It is analysis of fixed capital versus circulating capital, a distinction that I think often gets overlooked in today's, fast-paced business world.
It's an important distinction, and one that highlights Smith's deep understanding of how businesses actually operate. He recognized that while fixed capital, things like factories and machines, might seem more, substantial, it's that circulating capital that truly keeps the wheels of commerce turning.
It's like the difference between like the infrastructure of a city and then the constant flow of, people, goods, services. That's what brings that city to life.
A perfect analogy, and it emphasizes why a healthy economy needs both, right? That solid foundation of fixed capital and that dynamic flow of circulating capital.
It's all connected.
Indeed it is, and that's one of the most important lessons we can take from Adam Smith, I think. The ability to see those connections, to understand how seemingly disparate parts of the economy all fit together.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a lot less lost in the economic wilderness now. You've been an incredible guide through, the intricate world of Adam Smith. Any final words of wisdom from the master himself before we let our listener continue their own exploration?
Smith was a firm believer in the power of, observation and critical thinking. He encouraged people to question those assumptions, challenge that conventional wisdom, and above all, to never stop learning.
Words to live by, both in economics and in life.
He'd probably remind us that even the most complex economic systems, they're ultimately driven by human behavior.
And that understanding human behavior in all its, messy glory is key to understanding how the world works.
Precisely. So as you continue your exploration of economics, remember to never underestimate the power of observation, critical thinking, and, a healthy dose of curiosity.
Wise words from both you and Mr. Smith. I have a feeling our listener is going to be seeing that invisible hand everywhere now. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the wealth of nations. Until next time, keep those questions coming and never stop exploring.